Warning, the following video contains opinions that are mine and not anyone else's. All viewers of Banditex are encouraged to form their own opinion and to not follow mine directly. Hello everyone, welcome back to another SpongeBob SquarePants video game review. In the last SpongeBob video I did nearly a full year ago, I covered Legend of the Lost Spatula on the Game Boy Color. Developed by Vicarious Visions and released in 2001, Legend of the Lost Spatula was an alright 2D platformer that captured the charm of the cartoon, but failed in some important areas. 2001 also saw the release of two other SpongeBob games. The first one was Operation Krabby Patty on PC. Because of how difficult it can be to get old computer games to run on new ones, we're going to be skipping this one in favor of our first ever home console SpongeBob game, SuperSponge, released for the PlayStation 1 as well as the Game Boy Advance. SuperSponge was developed by Climax Studios, a company I have heard very little about. They've worked on quite a few games over the years, including a port of Bubsy 2 on the Game Boy, Tron 2.0 Killer App on Xbox, and the two handheld ports of Nicktoons Unite, which was the only other time they worked on another Nickelodeon-based game. There's quite a bit of info on the development of SuperSponge that you can find online, as various prototype builds and content have surfaced over the years, including some SpongeBob porn drawn by someone on the team. Not sure why they did that, but I guess it does explain why they're called Climax. In this video, we're going to start with the PlayStation 1 version. I haven't heard a whole lot of people talk about SuperSponge over the years, so for all I know, I could be unearthing a hidden gem of some sort. Or maybe this game was lost to the sands of time for a reason. With all that said, let's stop stalling and get this show on the road. Our story this time is that it is Patrick's birthday, and SpongeBob wants to get him the best birthday present ever, an autograph from Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. Unfortunately, the old coots want nothing to do with SpongeBob, so in order to keep SpongeBob away from the Shady Shoals retirement home, they send SpongeBob out to do a bunch of chores instead. The story gets old pretty fast, and the superheroes, ironically, come off more as villains. I get that's the joke, but all SpongeBob wants is an autograph. It's not like he's asking for the invisible boatmobile. I think if the writing was better, then I could excuse it, but there just aren't that many attempts at telling jokes in this game, and the payoff of SpongeBob accidentally breaking their TV at the end isn't rewarding. By the fifth chore, they just give up and sign the autograph anyway, which just makes me wonder why they didn't just sign it in the first place, or even just say no. But that's not important. Let's talk about the gameplay. Surprisingly, this game is a 2D platformer. Considering how Search for Reptar was released 3 years earlier and took the 3D road, SuperSponge by default looks less impressive. But I'll let it slide, so as long as it's a good 2D platformer. I would like to imagine a world where this game was in 3D, kinda like that old Shockwave game SpongeBob Saves the Krusty Krab. Progression in SuperSponge is much more basic than it was in Lost Spatula. Where that game had a hub world and allowed you to play a set of stages in any order you choose, here you get a very linear map consisting of 5 chapters with 4 levels each. Your objective in SuperSponge is to find an item and then finish the stage. It may sound bad, but the items you have to find are always obvious. The map screen will tell you what to look out for, the item is usually next to the end, and in some cases on the endpoint itself. If I could compare it to anything, it would be the crystals in Crash Bandicoot games, but I think the items in this game are even easier to miss. You actually have to try to avoid these sometimes, and it's impossible to finish the level without them anyway. As for the controls, SpongeBob feels much better than he did in Lost Spatula. In that game, the button mapping was strange, as B jumped while A used an item. Here, X jumps, square is your primary action, circle is secondary, and triangle removes whatever item SpongeBob may have on him. Though I'll cover those more in a bit. While the mapping is better, and while the jumps are also much snappier, they're also heavier. SpongeBob just doesn't jump very high this time around, which can make some jumps quite intimidating, especially when pits or instant kill hazards are factored in. While this would have been okay in Lost Spatula, which had infinite lives, this game does not. In fact, Climax went backwards and gave this game limited continues as well. Should you run out of continues, you'll be booted back to the title screen and will go back to your previous save point, should you have one in the first place. Though Climax managed to fuck this stupid detail up completely by having the game reset your live and continue count upon loading your save file. So if you happen to be on your final continue, just save your game and reload it. You'll be back to the default settings. Why is this late PS1 game using limited continues anyway? These things stopped being cool back in the 80s, and it doesn't really make the game any harder. This game is much easier than Mega Man, and that game had infinite continues. I'm not even mad, I just find it really stupid Climax made the game like this. Naturally, to prevent death, SpongeBob will have to defend himself against these bizarre creatures. By default, SpongeBob can perform this butt bounce move by hitting X while above the ground. The move will only work once SB drops, so enemies can hit you while you're winding up for the attack. Because of this and the heavy jumps, I rarely feel comfortable using this move since I'm usually afraid of getting hit by an enemy anyway. SuperSponge uses the health system from Sonic games, with the rings being replaced by golden spatulas. SpongeBob will lose every spatula upon getting hit, but can pick them up afterwards. As you would expect, you can take tons of hits as long as you can hold on to at least one spatula, and collecting 100 will give you an extra life. Unlike your regular platformer though, there are only 100 spatulas in a level, so don't expect to find hundreds of spatulas in any stage. Your count is also set to 0 upon going to a new level, so these don't carry over like coins in a Mario game. Spatulas are also tied to a hidden side objective for full completion, though I'll cover that later in the video. If the idea of lives scares you, then you'll be happy to know that there are plenty in each stage in the form of underpants. You won't have hundreds, but you shouldn't be scraping by either. Aside from the butt bounce, SpongeBob can obtain various items through the game, which serve as power-ups or brief level gimmicks, and with mixed results. These range from a gun that shoots jellyfish, a karate glove, a jellyfishing net, squeaky boots, and bubbles just to name a few. Out of all of these, the gun is my favorite, but you won't have it very often. For the most part, these are all fine, even if the jellyfishing net is a poor man's gun. But one item in particular stands out to me for how bad it is. The reef blower.
With this coral blower, I can suck up all those seashells lying around and use them to break the rock walls!
No. That's the reef blower, like in the episode.
Using the coral blower on those rocks up there should cover up those spikes.
Okay, fine. The coral blower. How'd they screw that up? Anywho, the coral blower is a mandatory tool that doubles as something to defeat enemies and destroy certain walls. All you do is suck up something and fire it back. It's a simple concept and it gets the job done, but with many drawbacks. To start, wearing this makes SpongeBob hard to control, to where the ground suddenly feels like ice. The butt bounce move is also removed, which is a problem because you won't always have something sucked up. Lastly, all you can suck up is one thing at a time. Really? You can hold 5 jellyfish in one freaking net, but only one shell in the coral blower? The reef blower in the cartoon was able to suck up the entire ocean, so apart from not being accurate to the source material, it also has an unnecessary ammo cap of 1. You cannot ignore the coral blower either. It's required to destroy stone walls, which have the rest of the level behind them. I hate this goddamn thing. I always ditch it whenever I get the chance, and the game would have been better without it. You know what's weird? Despite the bad controls, limited continues, and even poor attack methods, SuperSponge is still a fairly easy game. Thanks to the spatulas, you can basically bum rush through anything with little consequences. Apart from that, the levels are full of checkpoints, so you'll never find yourself redoing large chunks of the level upon dying. You won't be spending much time in the levels anyway though, as the stages are all very short, and that's even when you aren't slamming the Ocean Man to every enemy. So I brought up how the spatulas are required for full completion. What did I mean by this? When you start a file, you'll see various party items on the file select screen. These are extra gifts for Patrick. To get these, you must collect a certain amount of spatulas in a level in a certain chapter. Should you collect enough spatulas and finish the level with them in tow, you can unlock a secret stage set in 6 Clams Amusement Park. Each stage here has 25 tokens in total to collect. These can be spent on party favors for Patrick. While this does encourage kids to get good in the main levels, what if I told you that these are worthless? This isn't a joke either. The only difference between endings is the amount of clutter on the final screen. I will say that the gift screen looks better, but honestly it isn't worth the trouble. Remember, if you get hit once, you lose every spatula. Yes, you can pick them up again, but sometimes the spatulas will go into areas you cannot reach. This makes SuperSponge a much tougher game, but not in a good way. You know what could have helped? A shield item, like the Sonic games this is borrowing from, or even just having more than 100 spatulas in every stage. Because of the problems with the combat and controls, avoiding damage is a lot harder than you think. Even if these were fixed, that still leaves out the screen size. For whatever reason, the screen is too zoomed in, which can lead to deaths that feel cheap and unfair. Did Climax not have time to address these issues, or did they really think this was okay? The secret levels themselves aren't anything special, and for whatever reason you die in one hit. You won't lose a life, but you will have to wait for the game to load the map screen before you can try again, which is just idiotic. Why not just put me at the start of the stage instantly? It can also be hard to know what's a hazard and what isn't. Did I just get killed by a fucking weight? If you do decide to go through with the gift side quest, do not even try to do it on the final levels in a chapter. These all contain boss battles, none of which are any good. A good chunk of these fights come from random creations that don't fit SpongeBob at all. A parasitic worm, a robot fish. These don't look like anything that could have been in the show. The fights with the mother jellyfish and the Flying Dutchman are a little better, in that these are more in line with the cartoon, but the bosses in general aren't great. It's very easy to take damage from each fight, which is made worse by the bosses moving faster as they take more damage. Figuring out how to beat each boss isn't too challenging, since you're given hints to beat each boss just before you fight them, so you shouldn't spend too much time on any of them. To top it off, should you die, the boss will not regain any of its health, so they really don't put up much of a fight. This all applies to the final boss in the game, which is against the strangest foe to ever exist in SpongeBob history. The robot dogfish. No, I am not making this up. Even the hint admits this thing is weird. Look, I get that SpongeBob was still new when this game was released, but why not include something like the Dirty Bubble? You already have Man Ray as a standard enemy for some reason. I'm split on the graphics. I'll start with the bad, which are the character sprites. A lot of characters in this game are just stock images animated to blink and nothing more. Patrick himself flips through several poses and just looks terrible. Some characters are actually made from scratch, and these vary in quality. SpongeBob is probably the best looking character in the game, but even he has problems. Check out his looking up and down animations. Down is smooth, but up just has SpongeBob's pupils shoot up. The weird characters become most obvious in the ending, where some characters are clearly in a new style. Now for the good, which concerns the levels themselves. Each stage is varied in its palette, setting, and vibe. You get basic SpongeBob locations like downtown and Jellyfish Fields, but you get new ones like the inside of a whale or a lava-filled cave. Stages rarely look alike, and considering how you have 20 levels, not counting the secret ones, that's pretty cool. Speaking of cool, this game sounds great too. The music has a lot of variety, and some of it slaps really hard. It lacks songs from the show, but honestly they weren't needed this time around. A majority of the voice actors do reprise their roles in this game. Tom Kenny, Bill Fagerbakke, Roger Bumpus, Ernest Borgnine, Tim Conway, but no Clancy Brown. Yeah, Mr. Krabs is played by Joe White, who voiced the character in Battle for Bikini Bottom, and he sounds just as bad here too.
SpongeBob! Now listen, boy! I'm counting on you to use this here coral blower to make your way around Bikini Bottom!
It does suck that Krabs is off, but it is still great hearing everyone else record new dialogue for the game. And while Joe White's Mr. Krabs is terrible, he's barely a character in the game anyway, so I'll let it slide. I think I can see why SuperSponge isn't talked about very often. Nobody really wants to play a game like this. SuperSponge is just a bad 2D platformer that doesn't have the charm that something like Lost Spatula, Battle for Bikini Bottom, or even Revenge of the Flying Dutchman have. I give SuperSponge a 4 out of 10. Of every bad game I've looked at so far, this is definitely the least offensive. If you're curious, SuperSponge on PS1 is dirt cheap, even if you get the game complete in box. But bear in mind that the entire game is about an hour long, so spend that money wisely. There are better SpongeBob games out there, so I think you can confidently skip this one. But wait! There was a GBA port. Just how different can this game be? The PS1 version was already a 2D platformer, so I can't imagine the GBA port being that much different. In fact, this version of the game is talked about even less than the PS1 game. So, is this version of the game really identical to the PS1 game, or does this one have something different to offer? Well, let's just jump right in, see what we're missing. To start, this version is a lot uglier. SuperSponge already wasn't the prettiest game in the world, but this one in comparison looks worse. The cutscenes have also been altered, obviously due to the fact that the GBA couldn't handle full voice acting, so everything here is text-based. This change is fine and pretty par for the course for this console, so I won't dock points for that. What is getting docked is the music. It uses the same songs as the PS1 game, but they sound horrible, especially with that weird wailing noise they keep doing. Right out the gate, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the two ports are the same game, but there are a lot of little differences that pile up. Progression is identical to the PS1 game, but the level design itself is original. No level from PS1 is directly ported over. This version technically has its own levels. The levels in this game even have some enemies not seen on the PS1 game, so if you're familiar with that version, you may be surprised at points. Apart from that, SpongeBob has seen some minor tweaks. To start, the Karate Glove is on by default, which gives SB more options to defend himself. The Karate Glove on PS1 was a timed item, which I thought was a bad decision, so I'm glad it's a part of SpongeBob's default moveset in this version. The butt bounce is still an option, but I find it less useful this time around. In fact, I seem to get hit more in this one than the PS1 game. The Karate Glove is still better, but the range is pretty poor, and there is a bit of a delay. SpongeBob will still come across items, but these are less common and in some cases worse. The jellyfishing net, for example, is much slower, which is a problem since jellyfish can actually hurt you in this game, and the strange arc you get by throwing them doesn't help either. The coral blower gave me the impression that it was better, since SpongeBob doesn't get butter under his shoes when wearing it, but the way this thing fires is pure garbage. How are you supposed to hit enemies with this? It also annoys me that you're basically stuck with an item once you grab it. In the PS1 game, all you had to do to get rid of an item was to hit the triangle button, but here you're stuck with it until the end of the stage. Aside from the way the items work, the controls on SpongeBob are a little better, though I'm specifically talking about the jumping. Sponge Robber actually goes up a bit higher in this port, so platforming is a little more comfortable. The health system has also been changed, as the Sonic Ring system has been ditched altogether. Now you get an actual health meter, which can be restored by eating food found in levels. Spatulas are still here, but now you only need 50 for an extra life, and they carry over from level to level, making them closer to coins in a Mario game. For whatever reason, there aren't as many spatulas this time, which is probably why you get lives from 50, but some stages can have as little as 20 spatulas. Yeah, this game still uses the same limited lives and continue system from the PS1 game. I'm not sure why the limited continue thing is still here. You get passwords for every stage, with each one being 4 letters long. Thanks to all these, you're less likely to redo large chunks upon running out of lives and continues in this port. Not that you would need the passwords anyway, as this game will still take you less than an hour to beat. Before you ask, no, there is no extra completion thing this time, so the 5 secret stages from the PS1 game are gone. It is a little disappointing, but considering how bad the spatulas were handled on PS1, I'd call this a positive. It still would have been nice to get the levels though, and it might be the biggest gameplay edge that version has over this one. One thing the GBA port has going for it are the boss battles, which are a little more challenging this time around, but that's really only because you can't just wail on them to take them out. You actually have to wait for the right moment, which can be a bit unclear. They also removed the hints for some reason. I'll be honest with you folks, I had a really hard time writing out my opinions on the GBA version. There are still some serious issues with this game, but at the end of the day, I think I can recommend this one over the PS1 version. SuperSponge on the Game Boy Advance is getting a 6 out of 10. If you have a Game Boy Advance and you want to give SuperSponge a try, I'd say go for it, but only if you can find it for a really low price. I spent about $13 on my copy, and considering how it took me about an hour to get through, I'd say it wasn't worth it. I think SpongeBob Legend of the Lost Spatula would be a better use of your money though. That game was a little bit longer, and also managed to look and sound better. Plus, the Game Boy Advance can play that one just fine as well. But I am currently done with SpongeBob for the time being, so I am signing off. Thank you for tuning to this episode of Banditex. I'll catch you in the next one.